Hello and welcome to Talk 4 of our parish mission. And I'd like to begin this fourth talk with a bit of a confession. And the confession is I don't like parish missions very much. Now, I don't say that to condemn the practice of parish missions. When I say I don't like them, I say I don't like them in the same category that one would say they don't like broccoli or hard-boiled eggs. It's not saying that they're evil, it just means that they rub me the wrong way. And part of the reason why they rub me the wrong way is how skilled and talented most parish mission preachers are. They have polished it down to an art. I remember once listening to a particular mission preacher, and I heard him in two separate parishes because of my formation, etc., that I'd wind up I'd go to different parishes across the country, and I wound up hearing this mission twice, and it was amazing how it was almost as if he just memorized all of the talks. And I said to myself, that sounds lovely, but I'd go insane doing that. Absolutely insane. Because there's something about spontaneity, not quite knowing what you're doing, that is so fun to me. So then I will admit, part of the reason, or something that might be incredibly frustrating about this parish mission, part of the reason why this parish mission could be frustrating, is how much it feels like a constant ramble. Well, it is. I'll readily admit that. I am using this mission as an occasion to figure something out. I'm not necessarily here to teach you. I'm, in fact, quite happy just to do this and to scream at the sky. But there is kind of a goal in getting it out there, because for myself, it gets out. Now, if you happen to get something from it, then hooray, but that's not the point. The point is to kind of figure this thing out. And the thing that's been driving me nuts has been the Church of Japan for several years. This has obsessed me for years. And I think there's a strange correlation between the form of the parish mission and what I was thinking about when it comes to the church in Japan and Father Rodrigues from the book Silence as a kind of symbolic connection, if the best can be described. I am a pastor and a priest on an island diocese. Japan has this island attitude. The polished parish mission is like an island, entirely self-contained and beautiful. And part of me wants to break out, but I don't quite know how. And so one of those things that the gospel represents in my diocese here or in Japan and for the universe is that God is an inbreaking power that comes from a foreign world. And so it's kind of strange then that Inoue, the Inquisitor from the book, treats the Christian religion as a foreign power brought by the European powers to subvert his authority. Or at least that's how it would look on paper. I think Inoue is even smarter than that. I think that he sees the symbolism of Christianity coming from Europe for what it really is. God coming to retake creation for himself. And he would like to keep his dominion. And I think that this is the secret temptation in all of us in why we try to keep God at bay or to keep our little island. Now, I also don't think that people trying to keep their island are entirely wrong, precisely because God seems to honor that little island for whatever reason. Now, in my short life, I have discovered that sometimes I suspect that one of the reasons that God holds us at bay is that if he were to reveal himself, he would smother our intellect and reason so as to destroy our freedom. It doesn't do God any good to create us for freedom to set us free, to create us for love, and then to turn us into slaves by the awesome power of his presence. So he withholds that. And so in a strange way, then God must become silent. And so in a weird way, Rodrigues is an enemy to God's plan in this. Now throughout this, I hope you've been getting the impression that I'm kind of hard on Father Rodrigues. And I'll tell you why. It's because he's the character I identify with the most. If I can see his faults, it's because I see myself in him. A young, arrogant missionary who looks at his friend, Father Gruppe, and thinks, well, I'm smarter and wiser and more stable than him. I know better. And Father Gruppe actually even says when they break up, I wish I had your faith. And not only does he treat Father Gruppe with a kind of condescending arrogance, he treats the people of Japan with that kind of condescending arrogance. He treats Father Valignano in the very beginning of the book with a kind of, he won't let me go. Honestly, does he not know my talent and skill? And then there's the other figure, Father Ferreira, whom the interpreter tells him from last talk's session has in fact apostatized. And Father Rodrigues doesn't want to admit it. But what he'll discover is that it is in fact true. Now, Father Rodrigues, in the next few sections of the book, which we will kind of skip over for a larger purpose, I call it larger precisely for the problem that I've just described, Father Rodrigues will behold Father Gruppe be what he could never be, and his model, Father Ferreira, fail. Soon after the trial of the Christians and his public trial before the Japanese Sanhedrin, Father Rodrigues is told that he must go out for a particular day's journey. And when he goes to a beachside and is told to sit down by a polite soldier who hates him. And he has to watch as Father Gruppe dies not only for the faith, but for his flock. All the Christians are wrapped in a kind of blanket and thrown in the water. And Father Gruppe is forced to watch. And instead, he swims out and tries to save them, and while trying to save them, is drowned himself. Because the Japanese had caught him and interrogated him and decided, we won't break him. Whereas the interpreter in the last session and Inoue could tell pretty quickly that Father Rodrigues would break. And he would break because of his arrogance. Whereas Father Gruppe knows his weakness and is willing to embrace it, or at the very least acknowledge it. And then they know that they will not be able to defeat him. So they make Rodrigues watch as he will die. After he watches his friend die, the interpreter actually berates Rodrigues and says, "You disgusting person, you're not even worthy to be called a priest. At least Garbe was clean." Afterwards, Rodrigues meets the symbol of the tradition of the faith that Rodrigues had received. And he discovers that Father Ferreira has taken on a Japanese name, has taken on a Japanese wife, and he starts and they have this conversation that Rodrigues can barely endure, and he's being told that Father Ferreira is now writing books on the deceptions and evils of Christianity. Father Ferreira, like many I've met, is ashamed of what he knows is his apostasy, but also treats the arrogant Rodrigues with contempt as well. "How dare you judge me," would be the statement. Because the only time that Father Ferreira is able to manifest some sort of backbone in that conversation is the moment that Rodrigues, in a naive way, describes how successful the missionaries were. And Father Ferreira knew it. He knew that they weren't as successful as they looked. But the sad thing is, they measured success wrong. And simultaneously, they thought that they themselves were faithful disciples and were measuring others based on that standard. And so by making themselves the standard of fidelity, when they failed, the whole thing fell apart in their eyes. Father Ferreira described himself as a missionary defeated by missionary work. But anybody who begins missionary work with an amount of honesty knows that they won't succeed. Jesus, on the face of it, didn't succeed. By any measurable metric that most evangelists try to have, Jesus failed. Friends abandoned him. Family, except for Mary, abandoned him. Disciples abandoned him. Rejected by the governance and his religious society and his family and his culture and everything. All abandoned him. And yet he succeeded. That becomes a paradox that will pull the mind apart. And what I find so interesting about our own world is we live this paradox. We've grown up, if you grew up in the West, grew up in a culture that has been saturated with Christian presuppositions, and yet people in good conscience can actually think that they don't think with a Christian mind. And I grew up in that world. And so, to save myself the grief and the frustration of trying to describe how the Christian world is both Christian and not Christian, and how going to Japan should have taught Europe that, and didn't, I can only describe it through my own experience. Now, I grew up in the Protestant churches, ecclesial communities. My mom and dad are United Church ministers, and so are my dad's mom and dad, and so are my aunt and uncle. It's been a saturated part of my life. In fact, my dad's elder sister, the only one in his immediate family that didn't become a United Church minister, became a social worker, really branching out there. And I grew up in a church world. But at a certain point, my family moved to Victoria on the Vancouver Island. And what was so interesting is when I got there is to how few people were religious at all. In the small town in which I grew up in prior to Victoria, not that many people percentage-wise went to church, but there was this understanding that the churches were some sort of social function, but it was of a dwindling kind. But in Victoria, that entire facade had gone. And in fact, a majority of the people not only weren't practicing, but were hostile to, and in a weird way, prejudiced against. And I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. I was just a kid, and I really had no time for church. That was just part of the background. The only reason I continued to give church the time of day is because my parents made me go, step one. And step two, I liked them. Even though I, like any teenage kid, didn't like my parents, at the same time I loved them. I respected them. And they were church people. And so when I would hear from somebody say, only dumb people believe in religion, I was like, counterpoint. I don't think so. But when I was growing up, junior high school classes, I was always taught about a universal morality that everybody just kind of understood to be to know and to be proper and true. And didn't quite hold. At least it did to my mind. But it wouldn't last for scrutiny for very long. They would just kind of presume, when you learn about Canada, that everybody just treats multiculturalism and diversity and care for the poor and care for the sick and care for the vulnerable as just a natural, simple thing. But when people tell you that in school, that everybody should know what that means, and you're in school, you kind of notice that there's kind of a dichotomy between the two things. Because high school is like a microcosm of reality. And high school students do not believe in intrinsic human rights. I defy you to try. How many high school movies have we seen that are a direct defiance of it? And yet, we maintain a polite fiction that all human beings are created equal. And I believed in that polite fiction. And so therein lies, in a sense, the strange paradox. I do not believe it is a polite fiction to call all human beings made in God's image and likeness as equal a fiction. But to believe without God that all human beings are equal is a polite fiction. Because by any metric, by any measure of how you look at the world, people are not equal. If you value intelligence, wisdom, then you will value intelligent and wise people over everyone else. If you admire video game skill, you will admire a great video game player over me. If you think religion is stupid and pointless, then you will think what I do is entirely useless. You can't just look at everybody in a lineup and say, I think they're all equal. Now, if God decrees it and has made it so and embedded it in nature, then it is. Then the problem is how we see it. But if one wants to take God out of the equation, then it's impossible to maintain. And this was something that I suspected as a kid, but couldn't quite figure out. Why was it I was getting long, protracted lectures by musicians, artists, and movies that Christians deny that all people have value, while they are also maintaining that some people have more value than others? It just boggled my mind. And so I just tolerated it for a while. Then when I got to university, I started actually learning some things. I got a general outline of human history in public school, but it didn't do a good job. And so when I got to university, I wanted to learn about China. And studying Chinese history was absolutely enthralling to me because I encountered a society that had invented every major Western invention before the West did, and did almost next to nothing with it. The printing press, gunpowder, social bureaucracy. They even have a system of philosopher kings. They had an examination system that found the virtuous and the wise in their people and then helped them govern. It was almost a utopia to me, Imperial China. And yet, for some reason, they stagnated. And that perplexed me greatly. Until an obvious conclusion revealed itself. It wasn't Christian. In spite of my great love for Confucius, and I still like his books, the Analects, he never had this stopgap that would say the individual person is valuable. In fact, he said the exact opposite. That each and every person is valuable insofar as they're valuable to the state. And their role in the state is their identity. And there's no separation between the two. That, while gaining my admiration, continued to disturb me. Now, I studied all of this because I wanted to be a politician. And I had this feeling that, this was in the early 2000s, that if anybody wanted to be successful in politics, they should know how to interact with China. But at that very same time, a glaring hole, a glaring hole in my understanding of the world started to come up. I knew nothing about the Christian West. And my dad made that abundantly clear to me. He said to me one day, Dave, he had that tone, Dave, you know, if you want to have and be able to foster a dialogue between the East and the West, it's great that you want to know about the East, but do you know anything about the West? I was like, Because, like a dutiful child of the late 90s and early 2000s, the only time period that I thought had any meaning or value was the 20th century. Why should I bother learning anything about a time and a place that did not have our modern technology? Modern technology has changed us entirely. And I was like, no. What you should do is study Western Europe in the Middle Ages. Fortunately, there was a class on Western Europe in the Middle Ages. And it started, roughly speaking, in the 3rd century, the 200s. Now, it didn't start in the 3rd century, the 200s, because the Middle Ages started then. Because you could see the foundation of the Middle Ages in that period. But it even went back further, this class. It went back to the New Testament itself. And there was a reading in there that absolutely blew my mind. And you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. For I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and that which you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and that which you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And that blew my mind. Because up until then, I had operated under the assumption that Jesus never intended to found a church or a religion. And what's even more hilarious is that I love the gospel according to Matthew, from which that reading comes. And for some reason, I never noticed that reading. And then I went home, I picked up the very Bible that I had read from and said, how on earth did I not notice that? Because it was there. And then the professor explained how that passage from the 1st century developed in its understanding throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. And it changed my world forever. Because all of a sudden I saw, not only in myself, but in Western Europe, the operative paradox that gave it, Western Europe, the advantage it didn't realize it had. I watched Western Europe, Western Rome fall. This is in the class, I wasn't there. Collapse, fall, rebuild itself, and overtake China. And then I started to ask myself, well, why? The only metaphor that I could come up with was from a video game from my childhood, XCOM. I couldn't actually play it, but one of my best friends from my childhood did. And I watched him play it. And during that game, the premise of the game is that aliens invade Earth. And when you initially are trying to defend yourself against them, you have terrible Earth-made guns and weapons and spaceships or planes or whatever. But through the game, you're supposed to reverse engineer the alien technology and create something that you can defend yourself with. That provided me with the metaphor for what had happened with the church. Alien technology from a different world changed everything. And it was a technology that was beyond the capacity of the people who had received it to fully understand. And so it did not surprise me then that the Christians, for hundreds of years after that, over 1,000 years after that, and until today, did not live up to the standards of the gospel. How could they? They couldn't. And if you see Christian history in that lens, as people trying to live with something they don't even understand themselves. It helps you understand then the supernatural character of the gospel that we preach, and why it's important then for us to preach it. Because when you are confronted in an internal contradiction, that it probably means that there's something about it that you didn't quite understand. Now, what this also does, however, is that it destabilizes the society into which the gospel is preached. One such book that reflects on this is St. Augustine's City of God, which is one of the first books that I read in this new phase in my life. Now, Augustine's City of God is a reflection by St. Augustine of Hippo, who was a bishop in North Africa, who became a bishop after his long and personally difficult conversion to Christianity, where God ruined his life and changed it forever. And he, against his will, was made bishop. And he became one of the foundational figures in the Christian self-understanding. But this book, City of God, is his reflection on the catastrophe of the sack of Rome. The eternal city, in the year 410, had been defeated by barbarians. And the pagans then made an accusation against the Christians that it's because Christianity has become the normal religion in the world that Rome had in fact been defeated. So Augustine starts off in the first part of this book explaining why that's a slander. And he also points out, he says, you entrusted yourselves to the same gods that were protecting the Trojans, and how did it go for them? So what makes you think that you made a good decision? That's a brilliant argument. But I also, while entirely agreeing with St. Augustine, I also disagree with him. I actually think the pagans were right as well. The introduction of Christianity did destroy Rome, because Rome was built upon the premise of slavery and domination. For all of its virtue, I don't want to look at Rome and think, ugh. It was built upon the premise of slavery and domination. In fact, the cross itself is a symbol of Roman oppression. It would use death and the fear of death to dominate, and then it would use the love of money and the love of power and the love of domination to further enslave. So how can you have an established social and world order that is built upon those premises in any way truly be compatible with Christianity? I don't think you can. And so Rome does fall. But the miracle of the Middle Ages is that a people that takes it mentally for granted that a lord can own people, that you can govern through violence and terror, gradually has to start breaking out and realize that true power comes through the pen, not the sword. That true royal authority comes through baptism and confirmation, not by being a king. It is of immense importance to understand that the anointing of a king was never declared a sacrament by the church. And yet baptism and confirmation were. That should tell you all you need to know. Because at every stage, the church, in wrestling with this alien technology, that's a bad metaphor, but it's the best I got, realizes that it has to change its social order to fit the truth of the gospel, not the other way around. And so God constantly destabilized the Western world. And it was from that destabilization that new life would begin. How is it that the most backward people on the planet by the 11th century had a renaissance in the 13th? It says a great deal. How is it that we are able to integrate a religion that emphasized mercy with the necessity of governance? I cannot even begin to fathom. How is it that a religion that emphasizes the importance of revelation created universities? How is it that a religion that has a church that calls itself one holy Catholic and apostolic can continue to call itself holy throughout the Middle Ages? And not only continue to call itself holy, but even more dangerously, to still succeed. This, for me, was the biggest sign that the church came not from this world, but from another. That she's still around. I read that passage from Matthew, and I said it'd be really easy, like many people have done, to describe a 1,000-year reign that would never end. And then it does. I watched 2,000 years compressed into one course over a year. And I saw events, scandals, tribulations that have destroyed religions, civilizations, and powers. Religions is not a good way to say it, but I'll stick with it. And the Christians thrived. Whereas the Chinese, in their wisdom, important, in their wisdom, realized that the outside world is a danger. And so in order to create peace and stability, you must lock the outside out. And the only civilizations that were able, and I don't mean this in a good way, to defeat China were the colonial powers. And again, I don't mean this in a good way. But one of the things that always struck me when I was studying Chinese history is that how rarely, not often, China was actually governed by Chinese. What would often happen is a foreign power would conquer China, and then they would become Chinese. The Yuan dynasty, the Ming dynasty, not the Ming, Qing, sorry. Ming was actually Chinese. They would conquer either from Manchuria or Mongolia or some other area. They weren't Han Chinese, they were, from the area. But the Chinese machine would just absorb them. But when the Europeans showed up, they were able to just say, no, we don't want that. It was the first time a tributary state actually revealed itself to be able to stand against them. And not only that, strangely, when they were far less powerful than them. I keep emphasizing through all of this that Asia was culturally superior to Europe in every way, and yet had found a way to find a rapprochement with the unknown in the world that they knew. So much so that they didn't know they were doing it. And so what I always found to be so astonishing when I watched East Asia's reaction to the European barbarians was one of, how did you not blow yourselves up yet? Remember when Inoue is looking at the 4 European powers as 4 concubines that are constantly at war with each other? And wondering, will they destroy the household? The miracle was that they didn't already blow up Europe. Now, G.K. Chesterton, in his book, The Everlasting Man, points out that Europe, by that period, had created an equipoise of all of the different cultural preferences of all the different local areas in Europe itself. You don't find the diversity of the people reflected in their society and their governance like you do there. That is until Europe stopped calling itself Christian. when Europe started to think that its Christian inheritance was its own by right. When we conflated the supernatural gift of God with our own national or racial identity. So in my own understanding of the fall of the West, it's what a lot of Catholics in the 1800s and the early 1900s worried what was called Modernism. This assumption that the mediated power of God inside the world is an illusion. That God only works in the world if God is working at all. And that God does not work in supernatural or miraculous ways. But something that I found in our Christian life is that everything that we do is miraculous. Reconciliation, the Eucharist, all of it is one big miracle. It's God constantly imparting new life to us. And when we, in the world, think that everything that we have is self-enclosed and contained, we've already misappropriated and misunderstood it. When I came to this conclusion, I realized that God would ruin my life forever. I could no longer in conscience not be a Catholic. And I became, like C.S. Lewis, a very reluctant convert. C.S. Lewis didn't become Catholic, but he described himself in his spiritual autobiography, The Surprised by Joy, as a reluctant convert, and I was reluctant. I loved my mom and dad. I love my mom and dad. I am incredibly thankful for them raising me in the faith. But I had to make a choice. The faith of my fathers or the faith of my father. And this is also where it gets incredibly complicated. I don't think my parents are wrong. I don't think the tradition of my fathers is wrong. And this is where it gets really strange. Because I would not be convinced about the arguments for the Catholic faith today that I was back then. But since those days, I have come to newer and better understandings of that old truth that I found so convincing. And I suspect that this is one of the reasons why many Catholics are leaving the practice of the faith today. We have willingly kept God in a box, in a nicely polished parish mission. Apologetics also suffers from this danger. We have questions that we create apologetic answers for, but what we forget is that our questions might not be the questions out there. We teach our kids the faith, we tell them what it means, but we do not listen about what their concerns are, what their doubts are. And so everything that we say falls flat. And the reason we do it is because we know in our hearts that the faith hurts. When Father Rodrigues encounters Father Ferreira, it's an image of the young, arrogant fool meeting the broken older man. And both of them will be operating under the same mistaken assumption that they know the gospel. Father Ferreira, part of the reason that he started to break was when he realized that what the Christians in Japan were praying to might not be the Christian God, but their idea of God. And this was brought out, actually, in some of the letters of St. Francis Xavier when they were translating the name of God to the Japanese, the sun god, the son of God. And so it didn't seem to be any different than the religion that they grew up with. But what Ferreira forgot is that Europe itself had to go through the same transformation. We use the words like consubstantial, hypostasis, essence. None of that's in the Bible. And if we refuse to translate those understandings from the Bible language to the church language, we've made the same problem. We try to create a stasis, a bubble, a perfectly polished rock where we're able to say, this is Christianity. This is my island. But we can't do that. God will break out because, as the Church of the Middle Ages and the early church fathers had to know, no matter what you say about God, the truth about God is always greater. So I'm going to give you a small little bit of encouragement at the end of this pointless ramble as I try to figure out what it is that I think. We can be easily tempted when our family members say ridiculously uninformed things about Christianity or the faith. But don't suppose that you're well-formed. Take their concerns seriously and reflect on what they say. Only ignore the person who has demonstrated a lack of desire to know. Like the scribes and Pharisees that challenged Jesus and attacked him, not to find out the truth, but that they might trap him in his words. God sees the heart. The sin of Western Europe was presuming that we knew the faith, and we sent out inquisitors to test people in their faith. And as always happens, the sins you visit on other people will also be visited back on you. Japan exposed the European hypocrisy in trying to treat the faith as their own personal property. We tried to create our own little island and make those we evangelize just like ourselves, and Japan saw right through it. Right through it. And eventually, the premise of religion disappeared, and then racism and nationalism took their place. And now we're doing penance. Now, scores of people have left the faith, but in a sense, they haven't. Just like St. Peter, who had to realize he didn't believe before he could believe. So must we. One of the other readings that professor opened my eyes to was from the Gospel of John. It was soon after the resurrection of Jesus, where Jesus meets John on the Sea of Tiberias and says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Simon, son of John, do you love me? Simon, son of John, do you love me?" It taught me a great deal. Peter tried to love God more than he could. God just wanted him. Peter's apostasy was a result of his presumption of faith. And Jesus says to Peter, as he says to all of us, "Follow me." O holy martyrs of Japan, pray for us.